Mahatma Gandhi, of course, set up the Natal Indian Congress in 1893 or 1894, somewhere there. So it's the oldest of the liberation organizations. The ANC was, of course, formed in 1912. Over the years, the different organizations started because different laws applied to different communities. So you had the African National Congress, the Indian Congress, the Colored Congress, and later on the White Congress. They worked unitedly. At first, there was the policy of deputations, petitions to the government. But the then leadership, after Mahatma Gandhi left South Africa in 1914, the Natal Indian Congress and the other provincial congresses fell into the hands of conservative elements who did not carry out the example set by Mahatma Gandhi, because they went back to the policy of delegations and petitions and resolutions. And so the South African Indian Congress leadership carried on with that type of policy until 1945, 1946, when two leaders, Dr. Naika and Dr. Dadu, they had arrived from Edinburgh with a more Gandhian outlook. So in 1945 and 46, they overthrew by election the more conservative leadership, and the new leadership of the South African Indian Congress came into government, into power on the policy of a unity of all the oppressed people, not just the Indians, unity of all the oppressed people, and also passive resistance. So after Gandhiji's departure, the first passive resistance was in 1946 against a law that applied only to the Indian community. At that time, the South African Indian Congress passed a resolution calling upon India to impose sanctions against South Africa and recall its High Commissioner, which India did. Also called upon India to raise the question of South African Indians at the United Nations, which India did as well. Since then, the treatment of Indians remained on the agenda of United Nations, but then it broadened where the apartheid policy became permanent on the agenda of the United Nations. So the 1946 passive resistance involved recruiting volunteers, and a plot of land was occupied in Durban, which was for whites only. And volunteers occupied that piece of land. 2,000 volunteers, Indian volunteers, went to prison. The rank and file volunteers were all sentenced to a month imprisonment. The leaders to 6 months. Dr. Laloo, Dr. Naika to 6 months imprisonment. Of course, the passive resistance carried on for about 18 months. The response from the other side was ignoring, of course, all this, and just more and more repressive legislation. In 1948, elections, of course, people who were not white had no vote at all. So the white voters of South Africa voted into government, a pro-Nazi group. Some of their leaders were even in concentration camp. So they came into power in 1948 on a much worse policy. And crudely, their policy was the blacks and the colors in their place, and Indians must go back to India. That was the policy on which they came into power, 1948. 1952 was the first joint passive resistance or defiance campaign of the South African Indian Congress and the African National Congress. In that campaign, volunteers were asked to defy certain apartheid laws. And in that, 9,000 volunteers were imprisoned. But again, as I said, the response from the other side was harsher legislation. Fast forward to 1960, when the African National Congress and the Africanist Congress were declared illegal. And that was after the Sharpeville massacre, in which I think over 60 people were killed, and the African National Congress was declared illegal together with the Pan-Africanist Congress. In that circumstances, there was no more room for peaceful methods, and the African National Congress decided on an armed struggle. The first phase of the armed struggle was recruiting volunteers, training them in the manufacture and planting of bombs. All over South Africa, libraries, restaurants, post offices, all these, there were boards, Europeans only, non-Europeans not allowed, non-Europeans and dogs not allowed. So some of these were identified for bombing. But of course there was strict discipline that when bombs are placed, there should be no harm to human beings. So it was for that campaign that Shirish and his colleagues, 3 of them, they were arrested and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. And Laloo Chiba and his group, what had happened is the leadership of the so-called armed struggle, they were all arrested, and there was the second layer of Laloo Chiba and others, and they carried on with this bombs, planting of bombs and so forth, and for that Laloo was sentenced to 18 years imprisonment, and his colleagues, you may have heard of Mac Maharaj, he was in the same group, he was sentenced to 12 years imprisonment for that, and they were on Robben Island together. Yeah, is there anything to add?
I think one or two things might be of importance that we mentioned. You mentioned the question of 1946 Special Resistance Campaign. That campaign left an indelible impression upon the leaders of the African National Congress, the dignified, principled manner in which they conducted a non-violent campaign against repression and discrimination. And as a result of that, the leadership of the Indian Congresses and the African National Congresses got together in March 1947 and signed what they called a Declaration of Cooperation, the essence of which was that there should be joint political activity between the African National Congress and the South African Indian Congress under the leadership of the African National Congress. And that led to the first defiance campaign of 1952, joint. That's the one thing I think we should mention, is something very important. The other thing was, he's mentioned that already, the other thing was that from there, what had actually happened was the formation of the Congress Alliance. And they then ran a campaign called the Congress of the People, which ultimately ended up adopting what they call the Freedom Charter, which today becomes the essence of South Africa's new constitution. I think those are the two things that I might just add.
Wasn't the Colored People's Congress also involved?
That was part of the Congress Alliance.
Yeah.
The South African Indian Congress and the African National Congress. Then there was the Colored People's Congress, or the South African Colored People's Organization. And those were the three organizations representing, national organizations representing the three ethnic groups amongst the blacks. Then there was a fourth organization called the Congress of
Democrats.
the Congress of Democrats. That was an organization of progressive whites. Whites who opposed the apartheid system. In addition to that, there were two other movements. One was SACTU, the South African Congress of Trade Unions, and they brought in the working class into that alliance. And the second one was FEDSO, the Federation of South African Women, bringing in the women's sector. So we had women, we had the trade union movement, and we had four national organizations representing the four national groups in this country. And that formed a powerful alliance called the Congress Alliance. And they then launched the Congress of the People in 1955. And then, of course, they were all charged for that. The government actually regarded the Freedom Charter as a treasonable document, and then 156 leaders were arrested on the 4th of December 1956, and Kathy was amongst those who were arrested. As a result of his arrest, up till then I wasn't involved politically. I became involved because he was my friend, and that's how we started, and he has remained my political mentor for the last half century.
One fact we have not mentioned is the alliance also included the Communist Party as an equal partner of the alliance. But the Communist Party was declared illegal in 1950, and it functioned illegally, and the African National Congress and the Pan-African Congress declared illegal in 1960. So by which time the Communist Party had a lot of experience in underground work. So when the ANC was declared illegal, the first requirement was Mandela was asked by the ANC to go underground. In other words, abandon his law practice and of course say goodbye to his family and continue the political work underground. That happened, and of course while he was underground he also toured the African countries and England, and on his return he was arrested and he was sentenced to 5 years, and we were arrested a year later, and he joined us when we were sentenced to life imprisonment, 8 of us, in the so-called Rivonia trial. Now I don't know how long you're going to be in Johannesburg, but there is a museum where we were arrested. There's all state-of-the-art buttons to press, and we have a video facts of what happened.
Can you, for us, describe a day on Robben Island? How?
Well, first of all, there was apartheid even on Robben Island. I'll give you the example of our group. There were 8 of us sentenced to life imprisonment. Our 8th colleague was white. And because he was white, he was not on Robben Island. Whites and females were not on Robben Island. So 7 of us sentenced to life. We were sent to Robben Island.
Excuse me.
And I was, among the 7, the only Indian. I'm deliberately saying this because show you how apartheid applied even in prison. Not only was I the only Indian, I was the youngest at the age of 34. I was the youngest of the 7. Governor Mbeki was 20 years my senior. Walter Sisulu, 18 years my senior. Mandela, 11 years my senior. So the first thing we had to do is to change into prison clothes. My colleagues, as I say, who were all my seniors, they were also 4 of the senior leaders of the African Congress. Because they were black, they had to wear short trousers. The rationale behind short trousers was all blacks, regardless of age, were treated as children. And children, of course, wear short trousers. I was given long trousers. But worse than that, when it came to food in the morning, breakfast, porridge, soup, coffee, I get a little more sugar than Mandela, but less than Dennis Goldberg, but the white prisoners were not with us. I get a quarter loaf of bread every day. Mandela and the black comrades got bread for the first time in 10 years, after 10 years. So that's how apartheid applied in prison as well. I think in India, my book has been published, and it's called No Bread for Mandela. It was published by the Indian, I don't know what you call it, the publishing house.
Yeah, publications division.
Yeah, they
Yeah,
published
okay.
it. It was published in America under the same title,
Mhm.
No Bread for Mandela, at the University of Kentucky in 2012.
Mhm.
So questions?
Did you have to work hard labor or anything?
Yes, we worked for 13 years with pick and shovels at the lime quarry. There was an advantage because we, on Robben Island, about 25 to 30 of us were completely isolated from the rest of the political prisoners. And when I talk of isolation, President Zuma, Deputy President Motlanthe, they were there for 10 years. They never saw us and we never saw them. We were completely isolated. Now, we were in these single cells and we worked at the lime quarry with pick and shovels. The advantage was we could work together in groups, discuss. We were not allowed newspapers for 16 years. So we had to resort to all sorts of methods to keep ourselves informed. We did. Got into trouble from time to time, but we had to keep ourselves informed. Even smuggled a radio, but when the batteries finished, we couldn't get new batteries, of course. But while the radio was there, it was very useful. Newspapers were first allowed after 16 years. Children were not allowed, and after many years, children of prisoners were allowed. I first saw a child and touched a child after 20 years. But that was not on Robben Island. Because after 18 years, 5 of us, including Mandela, Sisulu, we were transferred to a prison in Cape Town. So because there were only 5 of us, it was quite relaxed. And this little child came with her father, and she wouldn't stay in the car, and they allowed her to come in. So that was quite an experience to see a child after 20 years.
Anybody have any questions?
Well, first of all, I would like to say I extend my admiration and respect for your endurance with grace, this horrendous thing that happened to you in your imprisonment. Second of all, I was quite impressed with what Mandela was studying while he was in prison, and I wondered if you had anything special that you were studying and how you spent your intellectual time, if you had any, while you were in prison, all of you.
Well, first of all, in order to study in prison, there were obstructions.
Yes.
You had to have money,
Mm-hmm.
and that money had to come from your immediate family.
Mm-hmm.
If your lawyer sent you money, they sent it back.
Mm-hmm.
So that already was an instruction. But in spite of that, some of us were fortunate enough where the families sent us money,
Mm-hmm.
and we did manage to study.
Mm-hmm.
He studied, I studied. Number of us did study.
And did you have a particular topic that you were especially interested in studying, or?
Well, in my own case, I chose subjects
Mm-hmm.
where we could get in books.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to get in certain books.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, when I took African politics or history as a subject, we could get books in.
Mm-hmm.
So there was always an ulterior motive in selecting what to study.
Listen, what did you study? What did you study, sir?
I completed my high school studies at the age of 34 on Robben Island. While I was outside, I failed matric for a variety of reasons. We don't go into that. But then I decided to study once Mandela had impressed upon us. We were living together in the same section, by the way. Mandela had impressed upon us that the necessity of studying. And so I applied for permission, and I received permission to study matric, and 3-4 of us studied matric together. One was Eddie Daniels, who served 15 years. You must have heard of Billy Nair. He studied, he was also doing matric. I was doing matric and a number of others. And I finished matric, and then I did my BA. I did my majors in history and economics. And that's that.
Simple, huh?
What did you study?
No, I hardly studied. I just finished my matric, and that was it.
And he played bridge.
What did you do?
But there was a
While
lot
you
of
were at
restriction
Robben
in the sense that if you got punished for having broken one of the prison laws and so forth, you lose the studies for 6 months. And then after that, when they return it, you find half the books are missing and so forth. But other than that, I didn't do much study, and besides, up to 10.
Shirish was in the communal cells.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that makes
They
a
were
big
kept separate
difference.
from us. The
Uh-huh.
Rivonia Trialists were in single cells. We were in communal cells
Oh.
with all the prisons together and stuff. But we worked in a different section of the prison also.
Oh, okay.
We were given a 10-pound hammer to the whole day sit on a rock and drag the stone. They give you a big boulder, you chop it up into small pieces, and then they chop it up into finer pieces, and then take that and make a hill of all the gravel that's chopped and so forth. And then if there's no other work, sometimes the water from this coast covers the quarry. Then you got to now take that heap of stones that you chop from this end to the other end, just to keep you busy all the time.
Intellectual.
And when we first got there, I mean, we're not used to really hard work and so forth. So the first thing that's developed were blisters on our fingers. Starting in because you sit on the ground, literally, and this is what you do the whole day long.
Why didn't you tell them about the drivers?
Hmm?
Why didn't you tell them about the drivers?
No, when we first got to the island, the water was there and then lined us up and so forth. There's two aspects I want to highlight. You're practically naked, stripped naked, and the doctor comes around to examine you, take complaints if he's any. He had his stethoscope on in his neck here, and he comes to you and says, fit, fit, fit. Everybody's fitting, nobody's.
Fittest people in the world.
And then the next one was what you call who can drive. See who's got driver's license. So some of us that had driver put up our hands and said, you'll get a nice, maybe a cushy job. Only to find, hey, wheelbarrows.
No.
That's all.
To the human spirit that you can laugh about this now.
We shouldn't waste too much of your time.
Oh, no, hardly.
May I just make one comment as a South African? As it's been described and rolled out to us, I did my military training in 1972. These gentlemen were the devil incarnate, as it was explained to us. And that was the 1969, 1970, 1971. And as I say, I was in Otsar in 1972. And we could go to Cape Town and we could see Robben Island. Very special to be here.
And did you
Were
believe
there
it?
any?
Beg your pardon?
Did you believe it?
No, remember, I was educated by the Jesuits up the road here. They told us, those Irish Jesuits never let us forget that we were living in a system that stank. Other people have selective memory.
Yes,
In
one
your
thing
time, were
about
there
Robben
any?
Island, no political prisoner was killed. There was violence, not in the section where we stayed, but where the communals, but no political prisoner was killed. Political prisoners were killed by the police. Quite a large
Before
number.
they were sentenced.
Before we were brought to court.
Interrogation.
There was a law that allowed the police to detain political suspects for 3 months at a time in complete isolation. No lawyers, no visitors, no newspapers, no books. The only visitor you get are the police. They try to extract information from you. Under that, a number of political prisoners were tortured to death. And severely, he was very severely tortured with electric shocks and all. So under that, quite a number were killed.
Why wasn't he classified as a political prisoner?
One,
Why wasn't he classified as a political prisoner?
why
We
was
all classified political prisoners. All of us.
Oh, you were all. No, he was in the communal.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
yeah.
You see, we had no say on where we should be in prison. The police decided that the following group of following individuals must be in the isolation cells. Those are single cells, but the vast majority were in the communal cell. I think in the 60s, how many political prisoners were there?
About 1,250.
You know,
Out of the 1,250, about 1,200 were in the communal cells, and about 28 to 30 of us were in what you call the B section, where the Rivonia Trialists were. About 30 of us were there over the years, an average of about 28 to 30. We were kept there.
In terms of what Mr. Kathrada is actually talking about the killings, remember the other day we drove past the building I told you it was John Forster Square? That was as part of the problem. Many people supposedly jumped out of the building, which is not.
We met last night with Steve Biko's son. Steve Biko
Well,
was one of those.
Steve Biko was one who was tortured to death under that.
Yeah.
Under 90-day
90-day
detention law.
Were there any escape attempts from Robben Island?
Escape
We had planned
The
a whole
first
lot of
escape
but it's difficult.
was, the first and only successful escape was in 1658.
Oh, in 16.
They blocked that route after that.
In 1820, there was another attempt, but some of them drowned, and the others were caught and banished to Australia. When we were in jail, some of the prisoners planned to escape, but before they could even set off, they were caught, because they worked with criminals, and the criminals gave them up. So before they could even set off. So escape was impossible, really.
And another thing was that even if one did manage to escape, the waters were extremely cold. It's the Atlantic Sea, you know. That's the first thing, and the second thing is it's also shark infested. So the question of a successful escape was literally out of the question. Out of the question. Never do that.
At the beginning, we were allowed one letter and one visit every 6 months. That improved, of course, as the years went by. By the time we finished our 26 years, we were writing, I think, 40 letters instead of 2, and 30 visits instead of 2.
So in the prison, you had no interaction with Madiba?
Yes, we were together.
Yes.
Oh, you were together?
Yeah,
Good.
we were,
Yes.
you see, we were in the so-called Rivonia trial.
Okay.
Mandela, Sisulu, Mbeki, Mhlaba, those are the 4 most senior leaders of the ANC, and 4 of us. So 8 of us were sentenced in that trial together with Madiba, and we were on Robben Island together. The night of our sentence, we were just woken up, handcuffed, leg irons, taken to the military airport, where the shackles were removed, put on the plane, and we landed on Robben Island on a very cold, windy, wintry day. No, we were together.
Yeah, I thought, I get on the impression when you said apartheid, the whites and
The
everybody
whites were not
segregated.
there.
Okay.
Whites and our female political prisoners were also not there.
The Indians and Africans could stay together.
Yeah, African, colored, Indian.
Weren't you in the cell right next to Madiba?
The one.
Weren't you in the single cell,
We were in the same
Same wing.
section.
same wing?
Yeah, the single cell section. All the 7 Rivonia people were there. Laloo's group, they were there, and a few others. On the average of 25 to 30 were in those isolations, single cells.
So you
Could
could
you
talk
talk?
to each other.
Could you talk
When they
to
were
each
out on
other?
the rock,
Interaction.
when they were
At
working,
work.
when
Once
when
we
they
were
were
at work, we
working
could
on the
talk.
rock quarry,
But
yeah.
once we were locked up
When you can't.
at night, no talking. But there were ridiculous regulations also. The lights were on all night because it was a maximum security prison. But if you had permission